to me. Okay, I think we're all live now, and welcome everybody who's joined us and in the process of joining us. Thank you for being here this evening and for foregoing David Attenborough and the Antiques Roadshow to take part. Um, in considering what to say to introduce this Farmers Assembly, I found myself a little bit adrift, in part because the discussion around GMOs has become so tense and so divisive. And then earlier in the week, there was a small story in Politico. And some of you may know that Politico is not known for its great liberal bias, but it gave me a bit of a helping hand, because in reporting the NFU's virtual conference, it talked about the Prime Minister's drive to remove the shackles of regulation from gene editing. And it described gene editing as a disruptive technology. And I felt a huge sense of relief to have it called what it is, because in its scope of application, in the pace of its development, in the way that it attracts investment and diverts attention away from other approaches to farming, gene editing is a disruptive technology. It's right up there with artificial intelligence and mass surveillance and driverless cars and 3D printing. And of course, we've all benefited from technologies that were once considered disruptive. Netflix was once considered disruptive. But where once upon a time, disruption may have been a secondary result of innovation, it's now become a goal, often to the exclusion of everything else. And that isn't just an NGO gripe. Within the sphere of genetic engineering, there are urgent discussions going on in science and in law about how to adequately regulate something whose effects are unknown and unpredictable. We're in a really fragile moment, a moment when we are aware that the industrial approach to agriculture has outlived its usefulness and has become damaging to people, to the environment, and to animals. We're in a moment where, depending on the direction of change, the definitions of a lot of things are up for grab. Not just what is a GMO, but what is organic, and what does sustainability mean, and what is food, and what is nature, and specifically, what is agricultural nature. So alongside these questions, which I'm hoping are going to come up tonight, there are others as well. Is some form of gene editing inevitable in agriculture? In a world where we use all the tools in the so-called agricultural toolbox, does it sit easily? Does gene editing sit easily alongside more agroecological approaches? But also, if agroecological farming is our goal, then is there even a need for gene editing? A lot of very big promises are being made for this technology. In the UK, we're currently in the midst of a government consultation on removing regulatory controls from plants and animals created using gene editing. And in that consultation, the government says gene editing isn't genetic engineering at all, but a faster version of traditional breeding and or natural selection. Is that true? The consultation document also says that gene editing doesn't make use of foreign genes. Is that true? The document also says that gene editing will deliver a mind-bending number of benefits, including reduced pesticide use, greater yields, lower input costs, and therefore greater profits for farmers, resistance to drought and flooding, salt tolerance, resilience in the face of climate change, and the ability to feed the world. All of these complex benefits from a single, simple tweak of the genome. Is that true? And interestingly, deregulation is also being framed as a simple adjustment, a simple tweak of the law. And the problem is that with disruptive technologies, there are no simple tweaks. By its very nature, disruption cuts across every part of society, including human values, ethics, social and cultural beliefs and benefits, and economic considerations. And so there is a real disconnect between the scale of the problems that we face and the necessary scope of the discussion, and the claim that the answer is simple. So for all of these reasons, we at Beyond GM were delighted when our colleagues at ETC Group suggested that now is a good time to gather farmers together for an exchange of views, to explore from a scientific perspective what gene editing is, and to hear what individual farmers have to say. My hope for this meeting, first of all, is that you take away some food for thought from tonight. I hope it will, certainly hope it will inspire you to respond to the public consultation, which closes on March 17th, because I genuinely believe that farmers need to be a part of this discussion. And I really hope that tonight is the first of many such meetings. And I will draw a line there because I know Tom has got some housekeeping to do, and then we'll start to bring our speakers on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pat. This evening's pretty simple in terms of a format. If you've done a Zoom meeting, we're in a Zoom meeting mode. So we'll be hearing from the speakers as you've heard from Pat. Her colleague Lawrence Woodward is here, and we will be helping with the moderating. I'll be following questions in the chat. So if you are a farmer, a grower, or involved in fishing, or a labourer in any of those, we'd really welcome your questions. If you put them in the chat, I will draw them together. And if you're willing to ask your question in person, you'll be very welcome to do that if we can get to you in the time we've got. And then just to say, Lawrence is going to sum up the speakers before the questions, just to give a little overview. After the questions, we're going to finish at 8:45 sharp, and then there's an optional session. If you're interested in further discussions about how we discuss new technologies in the UK food system, then we'll be having a discussion about that, sort of what next after that. But that's a separate session, but you'd be very welcome. So with that, I'll hand back to Pat. Who is muted?
There we go. My mouse wasn't helping me much. Thank you, Tom. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Michael Antonio. Michael is a scientist who is the head of gene expression and therapy at King's College London. He has 35 years experience of working with genetic engineering technology, including gene editing tools. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed publications and has taken an active interest in the safety of GM crops and associated pesticides, and has published papers on both of those issues. Michael, you're most welcome this evening.
Thank you, Pat, for that kind introduction, and I'd like to extend my thanks to the organizers of this important event, very crucial, at this very crucial time, and it's an honor for me to be participating this evening. You heard from Pat the promises of gene editing in agriculture and crop development and advancing animal livestock as well. But please bear in mind that at the moment is just a wish list, because little or none of that has actually materialized, and whether it will or not is another question. What I will be presenting to you this evening is a short introduction as to what gene editing is, and to see whether certain key claims of the technology are actually supported by the science that underpins it. And then I hope on that basis you can go away with a clearer picture as to what gene editing can and can't do, and whether actually it's even going to advance agriculture in a desirable way, or whether it can contribute to agricultural practice significantly. So you no doubt have heard that the way gene editing is set apart from other biotechnologies, such as old-style gene addition transgenic technologies in agriculture, is that, first of all, gene editing is mimicking what may happen in nature, first and foremost. You know, it's like a natural process, and therefore akin to, and it's been called a new breeding technique, in fact. And then we have the claims that gene editing brings about a very precise alteration in the DNA in one gene or other of the crop or the animal, and this alteration, the outcome of this alteration, is completely predictable. And as a result, because of the precision and the predictability of the gene editing event, the product that arises from it is completely safe, and that we shouldn't worry about whether it's going to cause harm or not. So on that basis, the advocates of gene editing in an agricultural context are arguing that the genetically modified organisms, what constitutes a genetically modified organism, be redefined to exclude such that certain outcomes from gene editing based on these claims are excluded from regulation, and therefore they would be exempt from safety checks, risk assessments for health and environment, and there would be no labeling of the products once they've entered the market. So the question is, therefore, is this justified or not based on the science behind gene editing? Well, the first thing to realize straight away about gene editing is that it's a completely artificial, laboratory-based genetic modification procedure. There is no natural breeding involved at all. And therefore, by definition, because it is a laboratory-based GM procedure, by definition, it gives rise to genetically modified organisms. And that was the conclusion of the European Court of Justice, quite rightly. Their verdict was completely in accord with the science, and they said that yes, the products of gene editing are GMOs and therefore their products fall under the GMO regulation as it is. So, but nevertheless, so you say, okay, so they have to be regulated, but are the claims of nevertheless of naturalness, precision, and predictability justified? Well, the gene editing, the way that gene editing tools are conceived of to be used in agriculture, especially the famous CRISPR, the CRISPR gene editing tool, is that they're engineered to make what is known as a cut in the DNA at a predetermined location. And that's all the gene editing tool does, by the way. You say, yes, I want the DNA cut in this position of the organism. And that's it. Once it's made that cut, the tool has completed its task. The actual edit, the actual change in the DNA of the organism is brought about by the DNA repair machinery of the organism, of the cells that you have subjected to the gene editing tool cut. And this is where the control of the procedure, where any control over the process is lost by the gene editor. Yes, to some degree, and I will discuss in just a minute how actually even the initial cut, the targeted cut of the DNA with the gene editing tool, with the CRISPR gene editing tool, even there, the gene editor is not under complete control, but they're under some good control, but not complete. But after that, they have no control of the outcome. They're at the mercy of the cell's DNA repair mechanism, because broken DNA in the cell is not a good thing. It's actually very dangerous. It rings alarm bells inside the cell. And so immediately the cell's DNA repair machinery are activated to try to repair that break. And depending on how you set up the gene editing procedure, the process, then the outcome can be one of a number of different things. It could be destruction of a gene function, the tweaking of a gene function, or the insertion of a completely new gene function. Now, so far that may sound, again, quite precise, but actually the outcomes from this DNA repair process don't lead to what was once thought as just highly predictable fine changes in the sequence, the DNA base unit sequence of the DNA. But we now know that the outcomes of the DNA repair can bring about a plethora of multiple unintended DNA damage, collectively known as mutations. Amongst these unintended changes are first and foremost that the gene editing tool can cut the DNA, not where you intend it, but somewhere else at one or more locations elsewhere within the DNA of the organism and bring about damage there. But then also in terms of the outcome of the repair, that we now know that rather than just do fine little changes as you would like, the DNA repair machinery can bring about actually the loss of large sections of DNA, what are known as deletions, or the insertion of large sections of DNA or insertions. It can also rearrange the DNA around the cut site or that the gene editing tool has brought about. And finally, it can actually change a gene sequence so that now you're producing a completely new gene product, a mutant protein that whose function is would be completely unknown and unpredictable. And finally, if that wasn't enough in terms of unexpected mutational outcomes from gene editing, some of the components that you introduce into the cell, the templates, the gene templates that you introduce into the cell to bring about the gene editing, some of those DNA constructs can be inserted in their totality within the DNA of the plant, inadvertently introducing foreign genetic material into the genetic makeup of the organism. And that runs the risk of inserting, for example, antibiotic resistance genes into the crop or into the animal, as has been demonstrated. All of these outcomes I've just described, unintended mutational outcomes that can occur off target and at the intended on target gene editing site, have been demonstrated. I'm not talking hypothetically here. I'm mentioning these because there are high quality published papers in the peer-reviewed scientific literature that have demonstrated a high frequency of these unintended gene editing outcomes. Why should we be worried? The reason why we should be worried is that when you take all of these unintended gene outcomes that can take place, is that they will interrupt the functioning of not just your intended gene target, but many genes. So what this leads to is an alteration through the process. I should say that the process of gene editing is multiple steps. And at each one of the steps of gene editing, the growing of the plant material in tissue culture, the GM transformation, and the gene editing effect of the gene editing tool itself, all of these unintended mutational outcomes from this process alter patterns of gene function. And if you alter the pattern of gene function, you alter the biochemistry of the organism, of the plant. And if you alter the biochemistry of the plant, you could, it's perfectly within the realms of possibility, that within that altered biochemistry of the plant, you could either increase the levels of known toxins, or you can produce novel toxins and novel allergens. These are very real outcomes. And for me is that this is why regulators have to take the limitations of this technology on board and make sure that any regulation is process-based. So they take into account the process of gene editing and not just look at the final outcome. It's the process that informs you, not just what you can achieve, your intended outcome, but looking at the process informs you where errors can creep in, where unintended DNA damage can come in. And therefore, for me, it is vital that gene editing be strictly regulated minimally under current GMO regulations, because by doing so, it means that there will be properly risk assessed for environmental impact, but also for health impact for the consumer, whether that be a human or a farm animal. And as a result, this would be true to the science. Any regulation that is process as well as product-based will be true to the science, because as I hope that what I've described to you here clearly says that the science that underpins the gene editing does not support the claims of naturalness, of precision, of predictability, and safety. And that's why we need strict regulation in place for these products, minimally under the current GMO regulations, which may need to be strengthened to take into account the extra risks, actually, the novel risks that come with gene editing. So I'll finish on that point.
That's me not unmuting again. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you going through that and condensing it into the 10 minutes that you were asked to condense it. We'll be able to follow up with more questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure people do have some questions about that. But I'd like to move on to George Young. George is an agroecological farmer from Fobbing Farm in Essex. He is motivated, he says, to create a genuinely biodiverse farming system, producing as diverse a range of nutrition and fiber as possible, as well as plenty of interconnected areas for nature to breathe and play its part. So, George, please tell us what you have to say about the new gene editing technologies.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, and obviously thanks everybody for coming along this Sunday evening. Now, gene editing is obviously the silver bullet that we as farmers have all been grasping for. Finally, a simplistic, scientific, and therefore obviously safe way to fix many, if not all, of the issues we are facing in agriculture today. Issues related to drought and deluge, issues related to disease, issues related to pests. It's lucky we humans are so smart, because without our tremendous insight, the world would have died out millennia ago. But hang on, that doesn't really sound right, does it? The hubristic nature of humanity has been slowly eroding the natural capital of our planet for centuries, but with advanced veracity since the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism and consumerism became rife, and our society entirely abandoned living as part of the world, preferring instead to mine the earth for everything it has, crippling ecosystems for future generations. We are now the unlucky ones, living with the consequences of our forebears, climate change, and of most importance, biodiversity loss. Our current global population of around 7 billion is expected to increase to 10 billion by 2050. This is a statistic driven by increased life expectancy rather than birth rates. And currently, feeding our population actually isn't an issue. This is not to say that we don't have starvation, but that is an entirely different issue driven by logistics, food waste, war, and capitalist tendencies associated with food. But I'm going to focus on our agricultural issues for a start. Our job as farmers is to feed the world, except I really hate that phrase because it's actually kind of pretty wishy-washy. Are we talking about calories or nutrition? Do we want a healthy population? Are we growing to ensure that governments are able to enact global trade, or to ensure that our local population is well nourished? The agricultural system in the UK and globally is broken. Less than 3% of farmed land in the UK is organic, which means that around 97% is already reliant on synthetically derived agrochemicals and fertilizers. What's more, much of this agchem no longer actually functions well, yet farmers are desperate to keep to what they know, their little silo, be it arable, dairy, beef, horticulture. Very few farmers mix their farms any longer, a practice that used to be intrinsic to agriculture and has only been possible due to those aforementioned synthetics. With agchem breaking down, we have two choices: learn from our past mistakes and go back to mixed localistic production, or enlist the help of science to breed our way out of our current predicament. One sounds like hard work, so it's no wonder that scientifically advanced breeding is being touted as a solution, one that enables some form of lifestyle farming. So I'm going to take a specific example within arable and a specific example within livestock. So, arable. One of the biggest pests within cereal growing is barley yellow dwarf virus, a virus which is transported about by infected aphids, spread into cereal plants by those infected aphids feeding on leaves. So, breeding an aphid-resistant crop is an obvious slam dunk, right? However, the mindset to get to that viewpoint is so simplistic and juvenile and harks to the hubris I discussed at the start. See, aphids may be symptomatic, but they are not causal. After all, speak to organic growers about BYDV and they don't tend to have any issues. The issue is not about the vectored virus at all. It is about why aphids choose to eat the crop. Why are they enticed? And the answer is to do with over-nitrification of the soils from continuous chemical arable farming. This over-nitrification makes the leaves a veritable feast of sugars for the aphid, and also means that the cell walls in the plant are weak and not able to withstand the aphid's mouthparts, a double whammy of misfortune. Nitrification of the soil has a ton of other pollution effects also. Algal blooms in watercourses wreaking all kinds of havoc, for example. And breeding in aphid resistance to cereals doesn't fix that nitrification issue. It is just a band-aid solution, enabling this poor excuse for farming to persist. Now, let's move to a livestock scenario, parasitic worms. There are a ton of examples of resistance to anthelmintics within cattle and sheep, and worms within a herd have massive consequences to health and yield of that herd. So it would be super to be able to just instantaneously breed in worm resistance like that. Gene editing to the rescue once again, better welfare for the herd or flock, boom. But is it better welfare? Because isn't it actually poor welfare and husbandry causing these worm issues in the first place? Nature even has naturally anthelmintic plants in her arsenal. Sandfoin, birdfoot, trefoil, chicory, anyone? Naturally resistant animals would enable higher stocking rates, would continue the proliferance of set-stocked grazing systems. Resistance to wormers is itself actually an exciting tool to force change within the livestock industry to something that conforms to a more natural approach, e.g. mob grazing with diverse species lays, including those aforementioned anthelmintic plants. Now, I'm sure that my arable and livestock examples will have riled quite a few people, but quite possibly because you believe me to live my airy-fairy life in La La Land and not considering the people that we have to feed, yet that is the very antithesis of what I am doing. You see, there's one thing busted and broken to an even greater extent than our farming system. Our food system is a disgrace. It's inefficient, imperialistic, wasteful, a logistical nightmare. Let's take bread for an example, the so-called staff of life, now regularly touted as a source of intolerance. Intolerances, I could argue, have only come to the fore since scientific meddling within wheat breeding and food manufacture. Most Group 1 bread-making wheat with 13+% protein goes into 800-gram loaves made with the Chorleywood bread-making process. A slurry of flour, additives, salt, sugar, water, and a bunch of other junk, turning the raw flour to a loaf within about 45 minutes. But let's roll back to that flour for a second. This is flour generated through steel roller milling, an exceptionally quick process that peels the bran and germ away from the wheat seed and mills the endosperm into a pure white and thoroughly shelf-stable product. The bran and germ are where most of the inherent nutrition in that wheat resides. So this nutritionally devoid flour is converted to a loaf in record quick time in a method which leaves tons of live yeast in the resulting product and doesn't have any time to break down the inherent gluten. Is it a surprise that intolerances are on the rise? Essentially, this is a loaf which is calories only, a food product which will fill our bellies, give us raw energy, but it barely nourishes us at all. So how could wheat be treated better then? For a start, let's concentrate on the flour. Slow, stone-milled flour grinds the entire wheat seed, endosperm, bran, and germ. This can then be sifted to produce a more white flour if desired, but even in sifted form, the nutritious oils from the germ are still somewhat present, good for human health, but with the slight downside of now producing a flour product which does have a limited shelf life, around about 3 months. Now, take this flour and convert it into a bread with the addition of only 2 ingredients, water and salt. No additives, no random extra stuff. If we use a sourdough process, bread making will take 24 hours, sometimes even 48. And some really cool stuff happens with this naturally yeasted process. All the yeast ends up killing itself, and it entirely changes the gluten structure, making that gluten even more digestible. What's more, the sourdough process itself creates a bread which has 2 to 3 times the bioavailable nutrition of a supermarket Chorleywood loaf. I've actually heard that scientists are also looking to gene editing to change the gluten makeup of wheat to make it more digestible, presumably within this poor quality Chorleywood process. But my question would be, through that speedy breeding process, what else would you accidentally breed in? New intolerances that may take years to rear their heads? Quite possibly. Now, this is just a single example of how broken our food system is. Look at other examples of continuously monocropped palm and corn, grown purely to be chemically broken down into ingrediential products, such as corn syrup and palm oil. We have a food system that disregards the growing, massively over-processes, and in that over-processing strips out much of the nutrition, leaving us with high salt, high sugar, high calorie food, which, whilst cheap at the point of consumption, is anything but when you figure in the NHS bill that creeps up years later. My point is that yes, we will have lower yields if we grow organically and naturally, but provided we treat that grown crop with the respect, as we convert it to the food on our table, the nutrition grown with it will be there for us to consume too. Our world would be a much better place if we had a society that consumed 1,800 calories per day of nutrient-dense food, rather than 3,000 calories of nutrient-devoid rubbish. We might be skinny, yes, but I bet there'd be a whole heap of other health and psychological benefits. Now, I'll take a moment now to clarify that I'm not anti-science, anything but science used incorrectly or omnipotently will only spell disaster. One of the most base arguments pro-GE within agriculture is the COVID vaccine. I've had it leveled at me countless times that since we use GE in medicine, it should be allowed within farming, but I don't see how two entirely different use cases can argue for each other. I mentioned earlier that we need to focus on fixing the root cause, not symptoms. Much as though I was talking about agriculture, is the same not true for health? Heart disease, diabetes, cancer can often be diet related. So we should surely be doing something about the food system that drives those issues, right? Now back to COVID. Whilst the genuine cause of the outbreak of this pandemic may not have been categorically determined, it is very likely to have been via the wet market or animal conditions similar to that. Now we have the pandemic. Am I pleased that GE techniques have been enabled to roll out a vaccine swiftly? Yes, of course I am. But if we don't change our practices to stop that same causation, it is only a matter of time before the next pandemic strikes, and we will have to enact gene editing once again for vaccines, except there'll still be a ton of unnecessary deaths before that new vaccine for that new pandemic is ready. It seems to me that the justification for gene editing is that we as humans have decided to live on top of the world rather than integrated within it. We like to enact our arrogant will however we see fit. Whilst playing around with genes may allow us to do this for a few more years, it is patently clear that the world is dying because of our decisions. I can't imagine any farmer is a climate change denier, and biodiversity collapse is being so widely reported that disputing that would also be idiotic. So we have to change, not stay doing the same old thing. We have to relearn how to kind of live with our planet, how to nurture and nourish it, as well as how to nurture and nourish ourselves. Gene editing is persistence, not change, and should form no part of our farming system moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, George. That was a very passionate plea to treat the symptoms, not the causes, and to look at the systemic nature of agriculture and food production. Next up, Andrew Burgess, who is the director and owner of Produce World and the founder of RB Organic. He was born and raised in vegetable farming, he tells me, and considers himself a strategic agronomist by profession. He's currently a trustee of the Soil Association and chair of the NFU Organic Forum, and has formerly served on the boards of NFU Horticulture, LEAF, AHDB, and British Carrot Growers. Andrew, welcome.
Good evening, everybody, and cheers, because I'm not sure if it's the end of last week or the beginning of next week. Well, I don't know how quite to follow, George. That was awesome, and I didn't disagree with anything you said. I think one thing I need to just spell out to everybody is how I got into organic farming, because it does have a bearing on my opinions. I was brought up on a very, very intensive vegetable farm. Through no fault of his own, my father thought that spraying everything to death was what he had to do. And when I left college, my brothers and myself thought that we were doing too much of that, and the place was a little bit sterile, and we wanted to change. And over the years, we gradually moved away from that until one day a supermarket buyer told me that I had to start doing some organic if I wanted to continue supplying him with his conventional. And I did that and surprised myself as to how well we could do that. And being an inquisitive sort of person, started to investigate why. And over the years, I've become absolutely hook, line and sinker an organic farmer. I'll never go back to the other side. My business does do conventional, but my brothers look after that and I look after the organic. So one thing to say is that I've learned a lesson in my life, and that is always seek first to understand. So, and you've heard this before, I'm not anti-science. It's just that the science I've chosen to believe in and follow is biology and not chemistry. George talked about aphid control in his cereals. Well, we actually, using science, have been rearing and releasing predatory insects into our carrot crops to control aphids. There is no resistance to being eaten. Obviously, using all natural species of parasitic wasps and ladybirds. That's been a very fantastic thing we've done and has worked fantastically. Genetic editing, as with many other things, deserves a quality debate. And I get to hear sort of both sides of this, and we need to move away from the polarised and entrenched positions that a lot of farmers have. We need to listen and respect other people's points of views, and we need to be willing to change ours in the face of good evidence. And I'm hearing some good evidence tonight. But the bottom line is that we're all farmers and we should all stick together. I do have lots of concerns about genetic editing, but GE is not the same as GM. And we've heard this from Michael already, but GM is bringing in genetic material and GE is cutting and removing genetic material. Mutations happen in every plant in every generation. There's up to 90 mutations in every wheat plant grown. Genetic edited mutations are targeted and deliberate, but they are mutations that could happen in nature, not all of which are desirable or intended. We've just managed to master growing organic onions, and the only reason we've managed to do that is because 20 years ago, a seed breeder in Holland decided to backcross to find a resistant gene to downy mildew. It took 20 years to get that variety to market. And without that, we would really, really struggle to grow organic onions in this country. Plant breeding is a very important tool and always has been. And this genetic editing science is relatively cheap and easy. The traits that are sought and eventually commercialised are the key as to whether this turns out to be good or bad science. If you took nuclear fission, for example, carbon-free power could be considered to be a good thing. Nuclear bombs clearly are not. Enhanced nutrition, reduced carbon footprint, pest and disease resistance could all be considered good traits, although I accept they are all on the wish list at the moment. Roundup Ready would be a bad one. The rollout of the science into the fields is still several years off, and its cascade down the crop hierarchy from the big arable crops into my sector of vegetables is a long way in the future. So that's the case for. So now what about my concerns? And I've got plenty. The science and the traits, when they are released, must be regulated to some extent. The monitoring of the effects and the success of the claims must be verified. Farmers and supply chains that choose not to go down this route must have adequate protection from the contamination, and compensation must be available in the event of this occurring. Farmers must be able to make free and informed choices about this technology. Supply chains will also need modifying. There will most likely need to be 3 tiers instead of 2. Genetic edited, standard and organic. There will be plenty of conventional farmers who don't want genetic edited crops on their farms. The NFU don't believe this to be a silver bullet, but we must ensure that it fits into a balanced farming system, and we must ensure it doesn't get abused and create unintended consequences as a result of bad farming practices, as we've seen with GMOs in America. This can't be allowed to become yet another sticky plaster over the wounds of biodiversity loss, soil degradation and soil pollution. There's also concerns around trade. If the UK does go down a unilateral route, what will our nearest and most important trade partners think and do? It's okay saying that the USA, Argentina and Australia are all okay with it, but the reality is that about 40% of our food trade is with the EU, so it's a massive concern. Farming is already too tight into the grip of the multinational corporations who care little about anything other than shareholder profits. And I'm worried that just when it looks as if the shackles could be loosened by going down a more nature-friendly farming route in agroecology, another corporate stranglehold comes along in the guise of GE. Now, this is where I do think we need to be very careful, because ironically, as this is a relatively cheap and easy science, it is within the reach of small startup and SME companies. And a heavy regulatory burden will inevitably drive the rollout of this technology into the hands of the very multinationals that we're trying to escape from. So we need to be careful to get the regulation right and balanced. So in summary, but I don't believe it will ever be approved in organic. This technology may, if deployed properly, offer some benefits to the wider farming world. However, it needs an appropriate level of regulation and monitoring to ensure that the claims are delivered and businesses that don't want to participate are protected from the unwanted consequences. Farmers and consumers should be able to make free and well-informed decisions. That includes the transparency from the monitoring and clear labelling at the point of purchase. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. There's a lot to take away from what you've said, but what I'm hearing at the sort of top end of it is that there are limits and boundaries around all kinds of technologies and all kinds of approaches, and there is a need to look at greater differentiation between these different processes. Next up, we have Jyoti Fernandez, who is a farmer based in Dorset. She's the policy coordinator of the Land Workers Alliance Farmers Union in the UK. And for those of you who don't know, the Land Workers Alliance is a member of La Via Campesina, which represents over 200 million small and family farms across the world. Jyoti, welcome.
Hello, thanks. Yeah, I think I'd like to talk more about the social impacts, or the potential social impacts, and the trade-off when it comes to R&D budgets that I've experienced as a farmer and working with many farmers across the world. Because more than the science, I think that's where I'm very worried about the deregulation of gene editing, and having seen the way it impacts farmers in the process of where we want our food system to go, is where I have those real concerns. As the Land Workers Alliance, we represent small and family farms producing agroecologically here in the UK. But as Pat mentioned, we're part of La Via Campesina, representing over 200 million small and family farms across the world. Many of those are very small scale farmers, like peasant farmers in Africa, Asia, Latin America. But also we have like the National Farmers Union of Canada, the Small and Family Farmers Alliance in America, many across the global north as well, who have followed more of the industrial process. And as a global union representing farmers across the world, we have a very clear stance against genetically modified crops and against gene editing, because of the fact that it's really produced a trade-off in the sorts of future of agriculture that we want to see. If we think about the majority of the world's supply is food supply, the actual global food security is produced by majority of small and family farms selling through local markets using agrobiodiverse crops. But they actually have less control of the inputs to the farming system, like the land and that kind of thing. And it's really been shown over time that food security can be provided by using natural systems, through using science and technology that comes from really observing what's in the natural environment and breeding seeds that are adaptable to local conditions, that suit the different ecosystems that are there, and using diversity within your farming system, using lots of different things like integrated pest management and different crops that can strengthen the soil so that it breeds stronger crops that are more resistant because they're very healthy. All those systems really work. And peasant farmers, that's the kind of small and family farms across the world that I'm referring to in many ways. They are scientific, and they really observe when they breed different varieties. And there's some statistics that show that small-scale farmers across the world breed 2.1 million varieties of seeds of over 7,000 plant species. And if you compare that to what's been bred by agritech corporations, is 16 varieties that they focus on. And it's a huge difference between 2.1 million varieties and 16 main focus by the agritech companies in the industrial food system. That's a huge difference. And what happens is that it's, it's kind of said, through the whole narrative that these companies have, is that, that is really backwards. Those small scale farmers breeding their own seeds by observing what's going on in the natural environment is really backwards. And we're very technological and very scientific. But the opposite side of it is that, what is that kind of attitude? How colonial is that, to realize, to say that all that knowledge by observing that environment and breeding something that's totally adaptable to the conditions that you're at, and the sort of farming system that's evolved over centuries to feed your local area, is actually, not scientific knowledge at all, because they're not high-tech scientists. That's an attitude that's just spun out by corporates across the world. And what we've seen is that it's increased farmers' dependency on inputs enormously, and laws get enacted all around the world that are pressure, that where big companies actually pressure like governments to try and change those seed laws so that it's harder to save seed. I mean, I grew up as a child in Iowa, which is in the middle of America. And, there are many, many small and family farms there. My family still owns 2 farms that my ancestors homesteaded there. And I remember seeing over the years the change from those farms being mixed family farms, where they would grow, all these different crops in rotation, not lots of agrochemicals, a good mix between livestock and arable, and it done much more sustainably, to the seed laws being enacted there, where it was illegal for farmers to save their seed. There was all sorts of problems with farmers actually having to hide and save their own seeds to be able to do that sort of thing. I don't know why it happened, but now when I go back to Iowa, you see that the farms are huge, and the farmers there are having to buy so many inputs. The fertilizers, they have to buy the seed, they have to buy all the chemicals to go on there, the herbicides and things, and they're really squeezed, and all those small farms have been swallowed up by huge farms. Now there's a big farmer that rents 5,000 hectares, and our little 300 acres is just one small part of this huge farm, and they're still making the same level of profit that they were at the very beginning, of getting bigger and bigger, because the companies are really squeezing what's going on there. And that accumulation of power and profit is what really concerns me about this focus on gene edited crops. And what I can see is through doing all the policy for Land Workers Alliance, when we're trying to, explain to policymakers, explain to people trying to put in, the kind of support that will be there for nature-based solutions at the climate change talks, or when we try and apply for research budgets to try and support agroecological research and development, is that gene editing and the potential for gene editing just kind of it seems so glamorous, it seems so technological, that it's very difficult to try and say, actually, we want some research and development to go on other things. We want to start researching different organic methodologies that look back at mixed farming systems and helping farmers, look at better crop rotations, or develop and breed organic seed, or look at natural pest control or integrated pest management, or any of these things that are natural solutions. It's very, very difficult, one, to compete for the narrative that these are really good solutions that need to be invested in, and 2, to actually figure out a way that you can get governments to leverage budgets for that sort of thing. I'll give one very specific example. Recently, there's an innovation pathway that's opened up by UKRI. And when you look very specifically at trying to apply for that, like our organization wanted to apply for funding for looking at developing technology to use waste foods and being able to figure out how to feed that to pigs. Now, that's not something to do with pest management, but there was all sorts of other things on integrated pest management we wanted to apply for. And if you look at the way it works, it requires a public-private partnership for being able to apply for that funding. And you've got to get huge amounts of investments of match funding, and there's thresholds, and you have to register for the conference, even for the initial thing to be able to get in there. And if you're not a specific company that's going to be able to supply all of that match funding, you couldn't even apply for the innovation pathway. And we've tried every angle. We've tried partnering with universities for all these things. And what's very difficult about it is that our solutions that we want to research don't make a profit. And that makes me think, okay, wait, what is it that they're after when they're investing in this technology? Apparently it costs about 136 million pounds to develop one genetically modified seed variety. And that's got to be match funded by somewhere. So those companies that are providing that match funding need to make a profit to make back what they're investing in that. And where does that profit comes from? It comes because it might go along, they'll have to sell the seed, it might go along with other agricultural inputs and all these things which put farmers onto a cycle of debt instead of trying to develop farming systems that are very resilient because they lower your numbers of inputs, so that you're actually getting a system where you don't have to buy loads of things to put it onto your farm. It actually comes from the farming system itself. And those can be more economically viable. They're better for the ecosystem. They're better for your animals and crops, all those things. It's a fantastic system. And I think what seems to come up all the time is that they say, well, but you'll get higher yields through these other sorts of systems instead of these organic systems that use all these things. And we say, well, it's not all about yield, and there's this whole land sharing versus land sparing debate. They say, well, if we get these high yields, we'll have loads of land we can set aside for nature. I was reading that in this Dasgupta report that came out the other day. They were saying, well, we need to do this because we'll save this land for nature. But if on an organic farm, on an agroecological farm, nature is across the entire farm. You've got nature embedded in every part of that. All those flowers that are part of your natural integrated pest management are attracting pollinators, encouraging insects, all these sorts of things. And really, it's never been shown that if you have these big fields of monocultures all over the world where they're shipping things through the whole global economy, that farmers are going to stop. They're on an import cycle. They're going to intensify. They're actually going to use more land and not leave land for nature. So we may as well have slightly lower yields distributed more effectively to everybody who needs it with nutritionally dense crops like George was talking about, and make sure that social aspect of it all is really paid attention to more. And then we've got nature across everything. Yield isn't everything. We already produce enough food for 10 million people on this planet, but so much of that is wasted. And in these agroecological farms, we can get waste. We don't have waste, but waste is recycled back into the farming system. It goes to another part of the farm. And so, we don't need to think about yield at all costs. We need to think about the social dimensions. We need to stop the corporate control of agriculture and that whole treadmill that we're moving down. Think about markets. What kind of markets will actually provide a viable living for farmers, and all those social solutions to what's happening to our food system and the squeeze that farmers are under by being paid below the cost of production by supermarkets, or having to chase, ever increasing, yields of stuff that they can produce at a cheaper price because they're up against the volatility of the whole global market. Those social things we need to invest in more and more into agroecology and less into corporate controlled agriculture.
Thank you, Jyoti. That's great. And I think you're absolutely right. The social dimensions are so often left out of the discussion. Usually it's a discussion around the science and the very narrow parameters of the science. Is it safe? Is it not? Mm-hmm. So that's a really important thing to bring on board. We've had a lot of information flying at us over the last 4 speakers. And so, Lawrence, if I may, I'd like to ask you to sum up in the way that I know you can all that's come before and where we need to be looking. Thank you.
Thank you. I was getting a little bit worried there about that I might have to argue completely the other side and make the case for genome editing in agriculture, because everyone else seems to be saying it's no place. So I actually dug out the NFU position. There's a draft NFU position paper that came out this week called "What You Need to Know About Gene Editing in Agriculture," and it's the the NFU position, and actually it's an interesting thing in that it points out that the legitimacy of agroecological approaches, of IPM. It says there are no silver bullets in farming. It says we cannot regard gene editing as the be-all and end-all, and but that this technology ought to be open to all farmers. So some of the things that we've been, or the speakers have been concerned about, the NFU position says actually it needn't be like that. We can look at it in a more rounded way. And that's fine, because to some degree, in fact, the government consultation document makes some of these points. However, the question is, why do we seem still to have this division? Andrew made the point, we can't be polarized. This is a new technology. We need to look at it in a different way to what how we looked at and treated old style GMOs. Because there's no question, some farmers do see gene editing as a potential technology that can help them in lots of different ways. Although gene editing is excluded from organic regulations, there are some organic farmers in Europe and certainly in the US who think that gene editing might at some point in the future be of benefit to organic farmers. Lots of farmers who want to get off the chemical treadmill, conventional farmers who wish to get off the chemical treadmill, and they again see there's a possibility of potential in genetic engineering, genome editing for the benefit of sustainable agriculture and a better food system, better food quality, and so on. So, so we can't just dismiss these potentials. The question is it really a potential? And how far is that potential being overhyped? How far can we have a serious conversation without the overhype that we had with old style GMOs? We also, another argument, and Andrew touched upon this, Andrew made the point that it's not necessarily the technology, some traits can happen, it's not necessarily the technology, it's how the technology is controlled, how it's rolled out. Joy T passionately made the point that we have to completely change the system. George also pointed out that we don't have agriculture in isolation, we have agriculture as part of a food system. So to what extent is it? Can we just look at the technology in isolation? Do we have to look at the whole food system and what lies behind it? And the claim that this technology being relatively cheap and relatively accessible will enable access to the technology from small breeding companies, from locally based breeding companies, from cooperative companies, from companies without multinational shareholders. How far is that possible? People argue in favor of the technology, say all that is possible. We do have to look at those kinds of arguments. Unfortunately, to date, we have what I would call a divisive consultation, and we are here because the government is consulting on the issue of genome editing, and we have materials from government, from the chief scientist group, from media, from prominent scientists in the research establishment, who are falling into the old trap of making claims, overhyping, and so on. In Beyond GM, in its bigger conversation program over the last 2 to 3 years, have been meeting with people right across the divide. And we found people involved in genome editing, part of their development process, not just researchers, but also involved in companies who own up to, in private conversations under Chatham House rules, who own up to the fact that they are worried about the hype. They're worried about how politicians, how the leaders of the research establishment talk about this technology. They don't believe that it's a silver bullet. They believe that the entire system and how the system operates and how is important, how it's dealt with is important. That we need a broader based consideration and a broader based consultation. Pat made the point that this is a disruptive technology. Everyone claims that this technology is transformative. Well, if it is transformative, if it can transform agriculture and the food system in the way that it's claimed, we need a debate and a discussion that's equally transformative, a debate and discussion that's open, that sets aside the hype on all sides, that sets aside the polarized positions and introduces nuance. So that's, yeah, the the core of which, or the perspective of which, we're Beyond GM are approaching this. Now, some key points that I just would like to draw out of people's comments. First of all, and Michael alluded to this, the government, the media talk about genome editing, gene editing as if it's one thing. And they highlight the fact that other countries have deregulated genome editing or gene editing. Neither of these propositions is correct. There are different types of genome editing, different approaches to genome editing. And arguably only one approach meets this claim that it's identical to nature or it could be found in nature. Only one approach. The government, the chief scientist group, this conversation, this consultation would have you believe that's not the case. So it's not defined. We have this broad sweep. Michael also made the point, and it's an important point, about process-based regulation, not product-based. Now, this does sound a bit geeky, it does sound a bit scientific, but it is a key, critical point, not just in the future of the gene editing that's in front of us at the moment, but also in relation to new technology, synthetic biology, and anything else that's in the pipeline. If the consideration of the process is based solely on analysis of the final product, you miss lots of things. If you're looking at evaluation of the entire process, then you pick up all these unintended consequences, and you can discuss and deal with how the technology fits into wider society and the commercial world. And all those other things, the values, the ethics, corporate control, come into play when you look at the whole thing as a process, not just a single analysis of the end product. And only in that way can we begin to see this, to begin to assess and evaluate the transformative nature of this technology. Michael made points which, other points about predictability, about safety, and he raised some very, very important points about the problems with the science. The government would have you believe, the chief scientist would have you believe that this is an agreed science. It's not, it's a contested science. Michael made the point that pointed out, showed you that this is a contested science. That's an important thing to bear in mind when you're dealing with the regulation. Michael also made the point that this regulation, that this technology, possibly the regulation of it probably needs to be strengthened, not weakened, because of its nature. George made a passionate thing about the need for system change, and talked about, gave two examples, both of which he outlined how the problem, how those two problems are problems of the production system, not technology problems per se. And again, bringing that together with the need about the food system, the Chorleywood system, and so on. Andrew made a point, again, he made, I think, did a valiant job in pointing out the arguments that some people are putting forward in terms of in favor of this technology or its use. He made the point that genome editing is not the same with GMOs, although I think Michael's point is opposed to that. Michael believes that essentially these are GMOs. The science says they're GMOs, the legality says they're GMOs, so it's different. But Andrew did identify some aspects of genetic engineering in breeding, for example, speeding up breeding, that some of these traits can be used for good, can be used to bring about sustainable agriculture, that in theory, corporate control could be loosened by this technology. But he came back to, in the end, the need for regulation, the need for proper, transparent, democratic regulation that gives choice to farmers and gives choice to consumers. Something I have to say that neither the government nor the NFU in their responses deal with. It's just thrown away, you know, okay, yeah, we can have farmers farming organically, we can give consumers what they want in terms of organic crops, we can have farmers doing their identity preserve stuff, but they don't talk about how to do that. There's no discussion in this regulation about how farmers who don't want to use this technology can be protected, farmers who want to use some aspects of this technology can be protected, and how consumers can have transparency and so on. So the consultation doesn't deal with any of that. The NFU position paper does not deal with any of that. Jyoti's points about the social and political aspects, again, equally passionate as the other three speakers, all of whom, by the way, I think were excellent. Jyoti made the point about the need to broaden, roll out research and development. And the really dispiriting, depressing example she gave about how innovation in UK agriculture, everybody talks about innovation. Researchers talk about innovation, government talks about innovation, media talk about innovation. We need innovation. This is going to make Britain great. We need innovation. But what kind of innovation? An innovation based on public-private partnerships, secret deals, memorandum of understanding that are not in the public domain. So these are the kinds of questions, and Jyoti outlined how that was happening. So those are some pluses, some minuses. The interesting point, the other point that you need to be grasped, or we need to have firmly in our heads, is that this unseemly, untimely push for the rollout of genome editing before all the safety issues and all the other issues have been dealt with, is that this is part of the post-Brexit industrial strategy. Our government sees high-tech intellectual property as the savior of our technology. Genome editing in agriculture is the key to that. There's really, the evidence for genome editing in agriculture and the benefits are really very limited. At the most, they've listed 46 traits that might be developed, and they are a long, 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 long way from the market. And in order to come to the market, they have to be rolled out within the current model. What this is important for this government is to open up the biotech industry, the biotech revolution, deregulate genome editing in agriculture, and you open up light touch regulation for synthetic biology, for the whole biotechnology revolution in all other areas of our industry and our society. This is why we come to the conclusion this is a divisive consultation. We're making it a divisive technology, where some of us might think there's no role for this technology, but others, very sensitive to the issues of climate change, other people sensitive to the issues of climate change, sensitive to the issues of sustainability, sensitive to the issues of the need for food quality and consumers, think that there might be something in this technology. What we have to be clear is whether or not we are producing the right kind of regulatory approach, having the right kind of discussion about the checks and balances, about the monitoring, and about the democratic control of this technology that can allow us to consider the potential benefits of the technology within an equitable society, within an equitable farming system, and within a society that is fit for purpose in terms of operating and being and existing in a world of finite diminishing resources. This consultation put forward by the government does not deal with any of those issues, but the technology raises those issues. And I hope that you will address the technology, involve yourselves with the consultation, but have those thoughts in mind when you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Tom, I think I'm going to turn over to you now to handle the question and answer sessions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pat. Thanks to all four speakers. That was really stimulating. I just want to check. Great. Well, I thought we'd lost Andrew to an Arctic explorer, but he has returned. That's great. So we have all four speakers listening. So what I've done is collated the questions a little bit into themes, and I thought, first of all, circling right back to the beginning and also giving a chance for those who arrived late to hear his perspective straight away, there are four questions that I thought I'd let Michael answer, and the other speakers can come in as well if they want. And first person who I'd ask to unmute and turn their video on if they want to and ask their question is Denise Walton, who was asking about geneticists' ability to undo things and the heritability of things. So over to you, Denise, if you're able to use the technology.
Hi, darling. Great. Yes, just listening to the Zoom thing.
Sorry, Mary took a call, but we've got Denise. Over to you. It's like the parish council. Yeah, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. This issue of unintended consequence, I find when I've had discussions with geneticists about this issue, they tend to use that as a way of deflecting their responsibility for the impact of GE, arguing that the unintended consequences of GE are no more than you might expect from natural plant breeding. So they acknowledge that there are unintended consequences, but because GE is so similar to plant breeding or animal breeding, that in a way they sort of almost deflect the responsibility for that. So which worries me. And also just sort of the second part of my question was, from my understanding, the issue really is about heritability. I mean, obviously medical gene therapy is very important. It works, you know, it's a very important therapy. Cystic fibrosis, for example, is based on gene therapy. But the issue is heritability. That isn't heritable, but of course, GE and GM in plants and animals can be heritable, which again is another issue that needs to be sort of tidied up. So I just wondered perhaps if Michael could respond to both of those questions, please.
That's lovely, Denise. Thank you. Before I go to Michael, I wonder, there's a couple of related questions. One from Bill Grayson about unwanted changes. Bill, are you able to come in and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me, Tom? Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Bill, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's great.
Go for it. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So under the original format for GM, you didn't worry about the unintended consequences because the presumption was that before the thing was released, they would go through a process of human selection, and then the products would reach the market on the basis of what those scientists had decided was necessary and useful. And presumably that same argument is being made with GE. And then it's down to the other aspect of this is the regulatory system itself. How that is, who is going to do the testing of the effectiveness and the safety of these new products, and is it still going to be the companies that are marketing them? Because if that's the case, then it's no real regulatory system at all. We need something where it's independent scientists who are conducting that process. Okay.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Bill. And then just finally, before I go to Michael, Pammy Riggs had a question about hazard analysis. If you're able to join us, Pammy, that would be great.
Hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Really, I suppose I'm saying similar to what Bill has just said. And also I got rather frightened by Michael with his whole list of possible hazards as you went through the process of doing the to get towards the gene editing in the end. And I just thought about my little business of direct sales where I have to follow the HACCP rules, which were, by my understanding, set up by NASA in order that spaceships didn't burn up on the way back, into our atmosphere. So, we were worrying about that then. I think with Bill, I'm saying, is there going to be some sort of proper hazard analysis as this goes along? And in which case, who would be doing it? It seems like it would be warranted. It is food, ultimately it is food. It's not just about dropping your food on the ground or getting some bacteria from some cooked food into the other food. We're talking about our food here. So if I have to do that in my little area, then why should that not be applicable in this area too?
Thanks so much, Pammy.
That's it.
So I will pass on to Professor Michael Antoniou to answer those as best he can, and then I'll give the other speakers the opportunity to come in if they want to, but we still have another round of questions after that, at least one more. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. It's quite a lot of issues were raised there. Let me see if I can, recall them and go through them. Yes, indeed, there are through rounds of natural breeding that there will be alterations to the seed. They arise through different mechanisms, of course. We come back to procedure. The process by which variation in genetic sequence occurs will be different through natural breeding compared to gene editing. Obviously, the experience of farmers of being able to save seed and plant them year after year shows you that actually overall genetic integrity through natural pollination actually is pretty good. Whereas the unintended changes that are occurring through gene editing are happening through a completely different mechanism, and they could be missed. One of the points is that at the moment, I don't see plant gene editors using the right tools that give you a comprehensive picture of not just the intended, but any unintended genetic damage that has taken place through their procedure. And an awful lot of claims of precision, intended outcome without unintended outcomes, I believe are flawed because you haven't done your analysis properly. So, and for me, unless you have the regulators demanding that you do your analysis of your gene edited product thoroughly, you will miss unintended mutations or unintended outcomes that have arisen. I'll just give you one example that graphically illustrates that. An American company called Recombinetics generated a gene-edited hornless cattle, where they inserted a gene called POLD into the cattle. And this, by the way, occurs naturally. They're already naturally hornless cattle. And they mimicked that process by introducing this POLD gene into cattle through a gene editing and animal cloning procedure. And it was successful. And at the end of that, the company claimed that the only genetic alteration was the insertion through the gene editing process and cloning procedure of the POLD gene. Well, it turns out when these cattle were analyzed subsequently by scientists at the US Food and Drug Administration, where they did the analysis, I would say, more thoroughly and properly, they discovered that the gene editing template construction that drove the insertion of the POLD gene into the genome of these cattle, actually in one side, the totality of that gene editing tool was, that totality of that gene editing template was inserted, and part and parcel of that gene editing template construct that got inserted were the presence of 2 antibiotic resistance genes that confer resistance to 3 different antibiotics. Following this discovery, the FDA obviously argued very strongly that gene editing of animals must be strictly regulated to ensure that developers thoroughly genetically characterize the animals and the final product. So the same for me would apply with plants. At the moment, there is no obligation on behalf of gene editor, those who are gene editing plants, to actually do their analysis properly. And I feel an awful lot is being missed, and things that are reported as precise gene editing outcomes are in fact not precise at all, because there is missed genetic defects. Now, yes, it is possible to breed out. If you generate, just like with old style gene addition transgenic technology, we know that that was mutagenic as well. They overlap, actually, the two procedures of old style gene addition transgenic technology, GM, and new style gene editing, GM. There's an awful lot of overlap in the procedure. And some of the unintended mutations can be bred out by back crossing to the non-GM parent. You go multiple rounds. You will eliminate some, but you won't eliminate all of those unintended mutations, assuming you've characterized them all to start with. That is known. Work in my own laboratory has shown how, where we did a thorough molecular characterization of a variety of GM maize and compared it to its non-GM equivalent, we discovered many compositional changes that stemmed from the GM transformation process. So, and this is on a marketed, this is a variety of GMAs that had been on the market for many years and had gone through these back crosses to try and eliminate unintended mutations. So back crossing can eliminate some, but it clearly won't eliminate all, especially if that mutation is linked, as I say, genetically linked. It's on the same chromosome stretch of near the same region as your targeted gene editing event. So for me, we need to take this on board and acknowledge that even with our, with back crossing, you're not going to get rid of everything, which is why there must be thorough, regulation that demands that we use cutting edge. For me, what's missing in the regulations is the use of state-of-the-art cutting edge technologies of molecular profiling, as they're called, omics, molecular profiling technologies. Obviously, I don't have time to go into them now, but it's the kind of technology my lab uses all the time to look at effects of say, chemical pollutants in toxicology situations. And that's the kind of technology that we used to show that this variety of GM maize was not equivalent to its non-GM parent, even despite all the back crossing that had taken place. So I think this is the only way to handle this technology in a responsible way. Acknowledge that it is different in process. It brings about different types of unintended changes at the end of the day, and that you've got to be aware of it and use the right types of tools to make sure that you screen them for these unintended changes and they go through a proper risk assessment. Because just looking at composition and effects of the unintended effects of the GM process, you can still miss something, which is why I always argue for laboratory animal feeding studies, toxicology feeding studies, long-term, in order to prove something as safe or not. Because let's face it, the point about these products is, the point about natural breeding and unintended effects, we have a long history of safe use with this. We know what to expect, even in situations where toxins can arise, like in potato breeding or celery breeding. But generally, because of experience going back for millennia with natural breeding, we know what to expect, and there is a history of safe use. With gene editing, not only is there no history, there is certainly no history of safe use. This is a technology that's just been rolled out in the last 10 years. And yet government is proposing that we deregulate it with no history of safe use at all, but based on assumptions that we can predict the outcome of this procedure. And that, I'm afraid, based on the available science even now, is being disingenuous and is fantasy. And So I hope that answers the question.
Michael, that's really helpful. Thank you. I want to take us on to the question of seed breeding, and Stephen Jacobs brought up what to me is a relative ignoramus about breeding, but who spent a day, thanks to Pat and Lawrence, among seed breeders a year or so ago. Stephen, could you come in with your question, please?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, well, the seed breeding programs that we have at the moment, are they working? The DEFRA, and I have a view on this, I must say, I'm just asking a question. The DEFRA consultation propaganda, let's call it, says that we'll get faster breeding. Is that what we want? What do we want from seed breeding? And in the bit I put in the chat earlier, I mentioned Martin Wolf's Wakeling's population, which is across composite, so all modern weeds actually. But that gave a diversity because Martin wanted something that would work in the field in terms of ecology. And what people have done since is found that it mills well and bakes well, so it can work economically for the farmer. So from my side, seed breeding should be about profitability for a sensible farming approach. Is that what we're going to get from gene editing? I have, again, my own view on that, but if we can frame around this idea that, according to George Eustace, faster is better, is it really?
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So I wanted to allow the three speakers who didn't have a chance to come back on the first round to come in on, I mean, I think given the time, I think you'd come in on, as Pat says, anything you've seen in the chat. And then if there's still some questions that haven't been answered after the three of you have spoken, then we'll come back to you. But maybe if you could limit yourself to a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, that'd be great. And I see Andrew has unmuted, so I will go to you first.
Hi, Steve. See you next week. Anyway, seed breeding, is it working? No, it's not. But I don't think that's anything to do with whether it's GE or not. Seed breeding at the moment in more general crops than mine is not working because the breeding is too focused on varieties that are dependent on big fungicide usage and big fertilizer usage to be successful. So that's more about the traits that they're trying to select for, and I would love to see them selecting varieties that are more diverse, that have got better pest and disease resistance, and need less fertilizer. Well, if speed of breeding is important, well, it's obviously an advantage. If you can find a trait and get it to market quicker, that's got to be an advantage. The 20 years it took to do the downy mildew resistant onion was frustrating because we knew the work was being done and it could only progress one generation at a time, one per year. So it was a very, very slow process. And we were very glad to have it when it arrived. If that could have been 5 years instead of 20, we would have been growing organic onions for a lot longer, and we probably wouldn't have lost our competitive position to the Dutch. So speed is an advantage. Specifically to the GE thing, I mean, that's yet to be proven and decided. But I think the question is separate from the GE thing. So fast breeding for me is a good thing. And are they breeding for the right traits at the moment? No, they're not.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I want to give George, Jyoti, and then I think Lawrence is going to come in on specifically the seed breeding question after that. So George, you're unmuted, thanks.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd kind of take that comment just slightly further for Andrew, really, if you're talking about wheat specifically, I don't actually think there have been many really good moves in breeding for quite some time. And I think actually it's entirely the wrong traits have been focused on. And this is whereby you look at non-digestibility of certain glutens that seem to be coming through, and no one's looked at kind of the back end of what this breeding has become. And I think this is kind of a case in point across the board, that everything has been looked at from the wrong angle. And now it feels to me that kind of they've seen these issues, and now they're going to kind of leverage gene editing to very swiftly correct something that was probably broken in the breeding line 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I just think that's a really poor way of correcting something. It's a really kind of baseball bat approach to fixing something that's broken. And I just think that I don't think we need these swift methods. Well, I mean, Andrew's obviously got an example of onions where he does want some swift breeding, or did want some swift breeding methods. But I think on the whole, if we grow what's right for our area, then we'll probably be okay. I think we've actually got those solutions there already. And I think we're looking for too much. We're in too much of a kind of modern mindset about what we expect from our crops. And I think we need to change that and revert back to producing enough for a local market, which is very different to producing lots for a national or global market.
Thanks, George. Jyoti.
Well, I can just chip in and just say, I think that there needs to be an overall perspective of what we do about making sure we have a rich diversity of crops that are being continually in a living breeding system, a slow breeding, living breeding system that's regionally based, so that we have all these biodiverse crops, and you've got regional seed networks that are looking at what's the wheats, what's the onions, what's the strawberries, what's the potatoes, everything that's actually adaptable to this area, and a good mixture that farmers can actually draw from, and have that continual program being supported through public funds so that nobody's profiting from it, and that farmers are actually collectively working together. So we have that agridiversity to be drawing from as these problems continually arise, because as climate change makes things more variable, then we're going to need really adaptable and variable crops of all the different types of things that we eat, available to try and draw from whenever we need it, no matter what the climatic conditions might be for for that year. And for all farms to think about being more diverse. So if something's not working, you can draw on something else going on in your farm, and to increase the overall diversity on farms. So it's not just about, we're going to keep doing this one crop all the time. And, if there's a problem, like, we have to throw something at it to try and fix it. That, we need to be thinking longer term about our seed breeding programs. And there's an important concept of not focusing on uniformity and conformity so much with seed breeding, that we need more of the varieties that actually have a high degree of adaptability in how they grow from year to year, so that we can actually do that breeding quicker by having those kind of varieties that are more suited to adaptability and variability to breeding your local conditions. That's not so articulate, but I know it just from from doing it, really.
Thanks very much, Jyoti. So we are going to have another round of questions, but I wanted to give Lawrence a chance to come in on the seed breeding.
There we go. Yeah, first of all, just to deal with this issue of speed and how fast GE breeding is as opposed to conventional breeding or marker-assisted breeding. It might be in some cases, but it might not be in others. It actually depends on what you're looking for and what you're trying to do. In plant breeding, in plant breeding particularly, the actual the altering of creating the genetic trait or whatever is one part. A huge part of the bringing a variety to market is actually the ongoing trials and the teasing out of the mutations and so on that you want. So the complexity and the time it takes is not just based on that particularly genetic event. And again, the consultation makes the case that all breeding will be speedier. It's just actually not true. I mean, the more complex things you do, the more difficult this technology is, and the more difficult it is to do technically. So it's no longer kind of, one act, one trait. If you're developing complex disease resistance, for example, it's almost inevitable that unless you go into traditional breeding with a long time lag, then you are moving into old style GMO production. The simple genetic gene editing doesn't deal with those kind of traits. So that's then the other issue is about breeding and the structure of the breeding industry and the seed breeding industry. It's
Lawrence,
no longer
really
just
quick,
about
because we've got another
intellectual
round of
property
questions.
rights. It's how it's rolled out. It's who owns the rollout, who controls the supply of the animals or the seed or whatever. In our discussions, for example, with animal breeding, none of the companies we were talking to are interested in intellectual property rights in terms of patents, because they control the supply chain. They control the genetics through controlling the supply chain, how it's rolled out. And that's another issue why you cannot just look at this technology. You've got to look at as a technological thing. You've got to look at the whole system.
Lovely, thanks, Lawrence. I'm just conscious we've got some really stuff about the sort of social and economic aspects I really want to get in, and I don't want to overrun by too much, but with your permission, I think we'll push it. So run over to sort of 10 to, if you can stay that long. So Rod Everett had a question about trade. Could I bring you in, Rod? You're still there. Sign, Rod.
Yes, my question was really about the trade deals that it might relate to. It looks as though if you look at the pesticide regulation, they just had the consultation. A lot of the stuff behind that is to do with a trade deal, and I'm just wondering if there are particular trade deals that this relates to.
Great, thanks, Rod. So just because the signal was a bit wobbly, it's about the trade deals that gene editing might be part of, given that we know pesticides are linked to trade deals as well. And if they're still here, I wanted to finish this round with David Finney, with your question, please. You're there.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep,
can you
go
hear
ahead,
me?
Thanks. Yep.
My question, I was making comments really, which was really I can remember all this stuff 20 years ago going around and all the promises from GM, and the arguments are exactly the same. They're promises that could be unsubstantiated at the time and were being proposed and heavily promoted by government because they wanted that technology. Because they saw it as the answer to all problems. As an ecological regen farmer, I've come from the dark side to the enlightened side, and I see all the solutions in ecological farming, that we don't need this technology. And the history of technology of this sort has always been fairly negative, has given us bad outcomes. So that was really a comment. It's not so much a question.
Lovely. Thanks, David. So I'd like to go to the panel to our full speakers to just give a couple of minutes. They could respond to anything they've seen in the chat and say anything final they want to say before we close this section and move on to the sort of follow-up about what next. So if I could take us in the order that we started with, so Michael first, then I think it was Andrew, then George, then Jyoti, and I'll keep you strictly to 2 minutes. So I'll start waving and hopefully I won't need to interrupt you. Over to you, Michael. That's for everybody, not just the professor.
Right, I think I want to make two points in my 2 minutes. The first one is about how gene editing is quick and cheap and therefore will actually help small SMEs succeed. Well, actually, the R&D may be quick and relatively inexpensive because the research licenses can be quite inexpensive to acquire. We have to remember, gene editing is a highly patented technology. You would need to actually to commercial, when you get to commercial, you're going to have to negotiate very expensive licensing and royalty agreements. Small companies will not be able to do that, let alone university people working in universities. So yeah, at the end of the day, you're looking to partner with the big boys who do have the financial muscle to take the product to market, and you will sell it on to them. And an SME could literally be taken over by a big company. I see this all the time in my area of biotechnology. And it's the standard business model. They don't care. It's the way that everybody wins. The other point I want to make is about the traits, all the highly desirable traits that we've been discussing, whether they are high yield, disease resistance, pest resistance, perhaps drought tolerance, tolerance to other environmental stressors. These are what are known as complex traits. By complex traits, we mean that many gene families are functioning together to bring about this trait. Gene editing cannot deliver these. All that gene editing can do is tweak one or two, a few genes. That's not going to bring about this totality. These complex traits, the term that's been coined to use, or the genetic basis of complex traits is omnigenics. Omni being the functioning, the totality of the DNA of the organism is at the basis of complex traits. Gene editing cannot deliver on complex traits. And that is why, for me, it's conceptually flawed, and that we should be putting our money into proper breeding programs, because breeding programs do bring the totality of the genes that are needed to bring in a complex trait into a crop or animal or breed of animal.
Okay, lovely. That was perfectly to time, and I'll go to Andrew next.
I'd just like to address a couple of things. Firstly, the question on trade. I think that is a massive risk here. I'm in the fresh produce industry, and we import and export literally millions of tons of fresh produce with our European partners. Now, it's quite clear that I don't think the GE is going to be allowed in Europe, and if we unilaterally approve it in the UK, that is definitely going to cause trading issues. So I don't think there's any more to be said about that, and that's going to be a bad thing. The other one is we've heard a lot tonight, and I do share the idealistic view of the food market, and we'd love it all to be local and small scale. But the reality is that we're a long, long way from that at the moment. And if we're ever going to get anywhere near it, we've got a journey to go on, and we have to take people and businesses with us. So we have to have a dialogue, and we have to have practical steps that can be taken by large businesses that are hooked into and locked into this large national supply chain to be able to transition back towards a more local model. And I include my own business in that. 500 employees, £100 million of sales by every single supermarket in the UK. How do I engineer my business out of that to a local food model? That is very difficult. I would love somebody to give me the answer.
Thanks. Short and ending with a bombshell. George, over to you.
Well, yeah, I'm obviously very much attempting to build a localistic supply chain, but I don't have that albatross around my neck quite the same. So that must be a difficult conundrum for sure. I'm intrigued about this trade deal thing, just as a little side point, because obviously we have been importing GM soy and other bits and bobs and corn, I think, for a very long time. And the EU has as well. A lot of it goes into animal feed, but I believe some also goes into human markets. So I'm intrigued actually whether or not Europe would actually have a leg to stand on in not allowing export or their import of GE products, but I don't know. I think my point is that we already have the tools in the box. And yes, like we know we need to head to a more localistic supply chain in the future, and it's going to take time. There needs to be incentivization for businesses to get to that place. But very simply, we don't have a problem with how much food we're producing at the moment. We're producing enough. So why should we throw another potential spanner in the works in the form of gene editing, which could completely mess up a load of stuff? We've already got conventional wheat breeding or conventional plant breeding, sorry. Let's just stick with that, knowing that we're trying to change our whole methodology of production and sale to a better system with more food sovereignty at its heart. And let's not contaminate it and risk some really serious kind of issues in the future by enacting gene editing.
Lovely, thank you, George. And finally, Jyoti.
Well, I think about, that question posed about how we would move towards this model, towards local food, distribution, supply chains, more agroecological production. Well, it's all about where the political will lies. I mean, it's not like the UK hasn't tried something very big. We've tried Brexit. We're trying massive gene editing. We're trying all sorts of really massive things where huge amounts of government investment are going towards it. Look at the amounts involved in the advice and the negotiations for these global trade agreements. Look at the amount of money that the distribution of the power of the supermarket chains has. If there was the political will to do it, we could invest in figuring out the distribution systems to distribute things locally and regionally and nationally. That is possible. It's not like we don't try these things, but no investment is going there because there's companies that stand to benefit from these larger global supply chains through the inputs, through the genetic and the gene editing and genetic modification. And really, they've been saying, the global supply chain, global trade is going to sort out all our problems for so long now that's where the investment goes. And they've learned how to use greenwash. When I was looking through, the chat, and when he said, well, they're calling it nature-based solutions, that it's better for climate. They've learned how to use all these things and say we can support small and medium-sized businesses, all the SMEs. We can feed Africa. We can do all these wonderful things, and for people who aren't really able to speak for themselves. And I've heard so many farmers, all the farmers in India that are now protesting against this global supply chains. I talk regularly to the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, the farmers there that say, we don't want these kind of genetically modified technologies to be the ones that feed us. But when I was listening to the House of Lords debate, when I listened to George Eustice, they say all the time, well, we can feed the world, through using these kinds of technologies, we can solve the climate crisis. And it's always greenwash when they're not listening to the peasant farmers, in Africa, to the farmers in India who are protesting now. All of them are saying, well, it's caused, huge farmer suicides, huge amounts of farmer debt. It's destroying our livelihood. It causes bankruptcy. It's, we're losing our land. We're losing our localized food supplies. All of that. And they're saying we actually don't want it. And all the time, this greenwash on the higher level is being used to justify putting these technologies into place and putting huge amounts of our money, our public money, into developing these kind of technologies, but also backing up these sorts of distribution chains and more corporate control. And we need to kind of see through that and actually see that it's not the solution. And if there was the political will to move in the other direction, we'd have really vibrant rural fabric of businesses selling locally with really sustainable farms supporting biodiversity and nature. It's just about who's controlling the narrative.
Lovely, Jyoti. I just want to let Pat come in with a very final point on trade. So Pat, over to you briefly.
Yeah, just to say, it pays when we're talking about trade to think a little bit more creatively. We tend to think of trade as I'm sending my apples to you and you're sending your cheese to me. But as both Michael and Lawrence has pointed out, this is a highly patented technology, and patents themselves are useful for trade. If we're not just selling products, we're selling the patents that we create here in the UK as well. And, those things can complement or even substitute in international trade. So it's worth considering that really what the government is saying is we want to sell the technology, not the food.